Hello, everybody. Welcome to the evening Enduring Fascination with the Faustian Bargain with Professor Emily Bryan. I'm Jennifer Keller, the programming coordinator at the Westport Library, and this event is part of the Westport Reads programming this year. For those of you who maybe haven't yet read the book, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, the library has multiple copies for you to borrow, either in book or audio format or ebook. And I think you'll really enjoy Addie's story, which starts with a request to the gods that is answered by a darker entity. Tonight, Dr. Bryan will take us through the history of deals with the devil throughout literature. So who is Emily Bryan? She teaches Renaissance literature at Sacred Heart University, researching early modern drama, women's writing, and gender performance. And she spent over 10 years as dramaturg and director for education for the Shakespeare on the Sound Company, where she is now a board member. So without further ado, Dr. Bryan, tell us more about Faustian deals with the devil, please.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for having me here today. And introducing me to this extraordinarily beautiful book by V.E. Schwab. I had not read the book before I heard I was invited to talk, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So if anybody hasn't read it, I highly recommend it. I am here this evening to talk about the history of Dr. Faustus and the Faustian bargain in relation to this novel, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. Schwab's book is full of rich poetic imagery and is a text that meditates on the idea of art and memory and redemption. Large, human-centered questions about what it means to love, to forget, to remember, and to be remembered. What does it mean to be human by the end of this novel? As Luke, who is a character that is referred to as the Dark, he's possibly Satan, he's possibly a dark god. She names him Luke, L-U-C, for Lucifer. As he says in the last section of the book, Adeline, he says, a shade of pity in his voice. You have not been human since the night we met. You will never be human again. And this is the question. If Addie isn't human, what is she? What excludes her from humanity? Is it her seeming immortality, her inability to be remembered, her willingness to deal with the devil? And the book and the Faust legend that it interacts with invites us to ask, what are the limits of human knowledge? What is human goodness? What is the human soul? These are questions that the book necessarily engages with, and they are also questions that very old mythologies have thought about in terms of human understanding of their place in the world, in the natural world, to what human beings imagine is beyond the concrete. These questions go back to the earliest philosophers, to, I'm sorry, I just missed a little bit here. I wanted to say I'm thrilled to this evening to tease out some of the connections that I was so enchanted with in the book. And I welcome you to share any connections you might see with me. The book is full of tantalizing intertexts from Marlowe's Dr. Faustus to Shakespeare's Tempest and the Bible. And so for an English professor, this is a delight to read, each page unfolding a new connection. And talking about Dr. Faustus is for me like talking about an old friend. I wrote my undergraduate thesis on a comparison of Dr. Faustus and Prospero from Shakespeare's Tempest. These two characters were magicians and magisterial, and also, on some level, really awful people. Why are we attracted to them? And yet, when I read Schwab's book, I was reminded of a dream I had as I was writing about Dr. Faustus, 30 years ago. It was one of those deeply subconsciously directed dreams. I have told the dream so many times, I still remember it. And when I woke, I didn't know whether it was real or not. It was a kind of dream state that courses through this novel and also permeates the play, Dr. Faustus. Yes, this play is about a deal with the devil, and so is the novel, but they're also about the expansiveness and the limits of the human mind. Now, I could tell you about my dream later, but suffice to say, I think we've all had moments when we questioned reality, when we experienced deja vu, when we felt the uncanny prickle up the back of our neck. And this feeling, this sense of the edges and margins of reality that dance around our world, is at the heart of these texts. The intersection of the human and the divine, the human and the spirits, and the possibility that the limits of human knowledge are only set by the limits of human imagination is the terrain of both these texts. Adeline LaRue. Her name suggests a journey, a thin line, a street, a way. Schwab's book is full of this rich poetic imagery, and it thinks about art and memory and redemption. And what does it mean to be human? What defines a human being? What is divine and human? What is monster and human? How can human beings understand their world if they're not all-knowing? And if they are, does that make them divine? These age-old questions go back to Plato's allegory of the cave, which asks what risks are involved in seeking knowledge. Is there punishment for seeking to know too much? Plato shows that the one person who leaves the cave in his allegory of the cave and gains enlightenment is not revered, but suspected. Going outside the normal understanding of reality, broadening our senses, this is dangerous. This is also at the center of the Faust legend and the invisible life of Addie LaRue. This sense of striving for knowledge is what keeps those characters going. There is always more to see, to learn, to know, to experience. Consuming the world is living for Addie and for Dr. Faustus. So there are a few themes that I want to address that I see balancing between the Faust legend, because there are many iterations of Faust, and this novel. The first is the thirst for knowledge. The second is the desire for free will and independence. And the last is the artist's soul. What sacrifices does the artist have to make? In many ways, the Faustian legend has allowed artists and creators to think about this question, and therefore it has actually shaped the concepts of human artistic creation and how we talk about it. As V.E. Schwab noted, Faustus is usually a masculine figure, and at the end, I would offer that it might be interesting for us to talk together about whether these ideas about the sacrifice for artistic creation are gendered. Does Addie LaRue's way of leaving a mark as a muse reframe this archetype? Is the collaborative creation of Addie LaRue, which is gestured to at the end of the novel, a different path? So a little brief history about the origin of Dr. Faustus. He was presumably a real person who came from Germany. He was born in the 1480s. According to the Historia von Johann Fausten, the historical Dr. Faustus was an alchemist. He was a necromancer, a magician, an astrologer, a swindler, a charlatan. Can you name it? He did it. The last name Faust or Faustus is not really a Germanic name. It actually has a Latin root that comes from the word Faust in Latin, which actually means lucky or fortunate. So there's a way in which the concept of fortune and luck and fate is already encoded within this character of Faustus, really from the beginning of his origins. Now, the historical Faust date overlap with Martin Luther, but where Luther, the reformer of the church, the father of the Protestant Reformation, was interested in saving souls, Faustus seems to have made a deal with the devil for 24 years, during which time the devil would serve him, would never lie to him, and would tell him everything he knew. And in exchange, at the end of this 24-year period, Faustus would give his soul to the devil. That was the bargain and the exchange. At the time of Faustus's life, not many people seem to have talked about him, but in 1587, a chapbook was produced, and the author is unknown or anonymous. It was called The History of Dr. Johann Faustus, and was originally published by Johann Spiess in Germany, and then was published in England, and there were very many versions of the Faust story that circulated in continental Europe and in England. The chapbook was reprinted many times, and also the 16th and 17th century saw many puppet shows featuring Faust and Mephistopheles. Mephistopheles is the devil's servant of Faustus. You can see marionette versions today, even on YouTube. In the chapbook, Faustus's life and death is a moral cautionary tale about the dangers of necromancy and of inviting the devil into your life. There was an account of the terrible end to him. In some versions of the Faust legend, there's a wild explosion at his home. In some versions, when his time is up, when the 24 years are up, the scholars try to take him out of the room, and he locks himself in, and when they go back into the room the next day, it's blood-stained and there's nobody there. And then there are also tales of Faustus begging to have his limbs hewn before the end, and then put in a bath to be reconstituted in almost a kind of Frankenstein-like monster way. So the desire to be all-powerful, to rival the knowledge of the divine, is evident in countless stories, from Prometheus, stealing fire from the gods, to Eve's temptation, to Frankenstein, and of course, Faustus plays his part in this narrative too, and now so does Addie LaRue. In 1604, Christopher Marlowe's masterpiece, The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus, was published. Like the original Faust legend, Dr. Faustus is an ambitious scholar who makes a deal with Mephistopheles, a lower order devil, to be his servant in exchange for his soul. Marlowe's story fleshes out the Faust legend. First, Faustus's ambition is signaled from the beginning of the play, as the chorus explains. His waxen wings did mount above his reach, and melting heavens did conspire his overthrow. And there you hear the echo of the story of Icarus from Ovid's Metamorphoses, who flew too close to the sun and tried to fly. So Faust's pride and ambition, like Icarus, he singed his wings flying too close to the sun and drowned. The punishment for ambition is harsh and forecasted from the beginning of the play. There are some very interesting parallels that I would like to explore between Marlowe's play and The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, but first a bit about Marlowe, because he is one of the most fascinating characters of the Renaissance era. He was born in 1564 in Canterbury, the son of a modest family, but because of his intellect, he was brought into the King's School in Canterbury and then to Cambridge University. He translated Ovid from Latin at an early age. He translated Ovid's love poetry, the Amores, and also his Hero and Leander. Marlowe also wrote very famous plays, Edward II, Tamburlaine, Dido, Queen of Carthage, The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus. That is probably his most famous play, and he died sadly quite young in 1593 in a bar brawl. He was stabbed in the eye. About a year before the end of his life, he would probably have gone on trial because he had been accused of being an atheist, a spy, and a sodomite. He probably was all of these things to some degree, and certainly he was of a broad temperament in terms of inquiring about religion, sexuality, and identity. Scholars believe he was spared from prosecution by having worked for Sir Francis Walsingham, who was the head of spies under Queen Elizabeth. The play, Dr. Faustus, The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus, partakes of a kind of Reformation theology that supports Marlowe's relationship to Queen Elizabeth, in the sense that it seems to be coming from a Protestant view as opposed to a Catholic one. Queen Elizabeth did not tolerate Catholics, and, it seems that Marlowe might have been some kind of double agent, whether he was pretending to be sympathetic to Catholic spies in order to elicit information out of them on behalf of the Queen, or whether he was really invested in Catholicism. I think we'll never know, because his life ended so quickly and under very suspicious circumstances. But when I say that this play partakes in some of those Reformation ideas, I could give you a concise example in how the play represents hell. For example, some critics have said that if Marlowe's Faustus was written in the deeply medieval Catholic era of England, he probably would have been rescued by either Mary or one of the saints. You might think of the way Dante interacts with Beatrice on his journey in the Commedia, or even compare the accompaniment of Virgil, the virtuous pagan, to Mephistopheles and Luke, who are hardly virtuous, in Dr. Faustus and in Addie LaRue. Unlike Dante, the character in the Commedia, Faustus and Addie LaRue are quite alone. Now, Marlowe's Faustus really does come out of the tradition of the medieval mystery play or morality play. Many critics talk about it as a morality play. And certainly Marlowe does gesture to these plays. He has stock characters that come out, and in many ways Mephistopheles kind of represents a sort of stock character. And he in some productions, you often find they signal to the medieval Hellmouth, which was a stage convention from the mystery cycles, where, it would be this great gaping mouth of hell come out to take the characters at the end of the play. However, really, Marlowe presents a very different articulation of hell. I'm just going to read to you a little bit about how Mephistopheles describes hell. He presents hell as something internal, as something within that is everywhere. And now that idea might seem common to us, having read No Exit or something like that. But this was a new way of thinking on the stage. So hell is everywhere, and it's not a place that you go to. Mephistopheles explains that he and Lucifer are unhappy spirits that he fell with Lucifer, conspired against our God with Lucifer, and are forever damned with Lucifer. Faustus says, "Where are you damned?" And Mephistopheles replies, "In hell." Faustus says, "How comes it then that you are out of hell?" And Mephistopheles corrects him, "Why, this is hell, nor am I out of it. Think'st thou that I, who saw the face of God and tasted the eternal joys of heaven, am not tormented with 10,000 hells in being deprived of everlasting bliss? O Faustus, leave these frivolous demands which strike a terror to my fainting soul." "What," says Faustus, "is great Mephistopheles so passionate for being deprived of the joys of heaven? Learn thou of Faustus' manly fortitude, and scorn those joys thou shalt never possessed. And that there you can hear a little bit of Faustus's egotism, his kind of hostility towards Mephistopheles, his sort of know-it-allness, and there are some qualities that Addie LaRue shares with him. Mephistopheles agrees to take the bargain to Lucifer, and Faustus says, "Had I as many souls as there be stars, I'd give them all for Mephistopheles," and thus continues a relationship between Mephistopheles and Faust that in many ways tells us something about what the play is trying to say about redemption and forgiveness and satisfaction. We see this concept in The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, where another character named Henry makes a deal with the devil that he should be, and I hope I'm not giving too much away, that he should be enough for other people. And it's kind of a signal to me that Schwab is sort of tracking this experiences of this play, Dr. Faustus and the Faustus bargain. Because Faust is a sort of singular individual character who's very driven by ambition, very much wanting to strive beyond the limits of human knowledge. And he stands in contrast in his negotiation with the devil to earlier medieval morality plays and to the representation of hell. So in the beginning of the play, this relationship between Mephistopheles and Faustus, I think, kind of mirrors the relationship between Addie LaRue and Luke, or Lucifer. I think about who, and we might want to delve into this question, who exactly Lucifer is. There's a long history of Lucifer as a fallen angel, as one of God's favorites who challenged God and was thrown down and chained, as Milton would have him, on a burning lake. And in The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, we likewise see this love-hate relationship between Luke and Addie. And in Marlowe's Faustus, you see this tension between Mephistopheles and Faustus, that Mephistopheles is his servant, that he comes to the rescue. There's a slight difference between Luke and Addie, but that dynamic. But I think that might be an interesting place for us to talk about these differences. Between them, though, there is a kind of love between Luke and Addie, but there's also this level of deception which exists with Mephistopheles and Faustus. And for Addie and Luke, whatever joy they might find, it can never entirely be joyful. This is true of Faustus as well, who has enormous gratitude for Mephistopheles and admiration for the things he can do. But there's a sort of duplicity and a deception and an emptiness there. There's also, I believe, an undercurrent of attraction that Faustus feels for Mephistopheles. And Mephistopheles also uses sex, much in the same way Luke does, to distract Addie and Faustus from repentance. For example, Mephistopheles provides Helen of Troy as an object for Faustus to lust after and consummate, and Helen, this is where that famous line, "Was this a face that launched 1,000 ships," came from, to Faustus, and Helen comes in just as he's sort of starting to weaken in his resolve to follow the devil. The meeting of Henry and Addie becomes a sort of further torment to Addie. Luke gives her a taste of what she wants, only to take it away from her again. So much like Dr. Faustus, what keeps Addie going is this thirst for knowledge. It is never enough. After 2 years, Luke demands that she yield. So the bargain is that she should give up her soul to him when she's ready. And Addie in exchange for her freedom. And Addie says, "I saw an elephant." And the words are like cold water on coals. Addie's searching, lively mind thrives under the historical scope, the innovation, the beauty and art that she's witnessing. She's a woman who is 23 eternally, probably one of the best points of our lives, and she's born in 1714 and she lives for 300 years. At least. And the novel toggles back and forth between 2014 and 1714. And then all these points in between. Of course, Addie's pact with Luke is about freedom. She doesn't want to be forced into a marriage. She wants to live a life that is freeing and exploratory. And in 1714, for a woman, that wouldn't be the case. Henry's and Faustus's pacts are circumscribed by time. Henry has a year, hope I'm not giving too much away, and Faustus has 24 years. And in other versions of Faust, later ones that I'm not exactly an expert on, most notably Goethe's Faust, he is saved. Faust is actually saved. And we might ask whether Addie finds some perverse kind of salvation in saving Henry. Is her sacrifice really enough? In sacrificing herself to allow Henry to live, does that outweigh the attraction to the dark gods that she's had? In Goethe's Faust, it is that kind of negotiation in that he's saved because he doesn't fulfill all of the bargain. So I want to turn to this last theme that I see running through Addie's story and the Faust tales, and it's such an important part of Addie LaRue, and I think it is a very important part of the Faust legend, especially as the legend went into German Romanticism. And that is the idea of artistic inspiration and its cost. And if you were able to see V.E. Schwab at Westport Reads talk about her novel, she talks about that herself, the cost to her in writing and creating these characters. Even in her, acknowledgments, she describes this holding up these characters and for so many years, and living with them and keeping them with her, that there's a cost to her personal life there. In The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, there's a scene where Luke seems to suggest that artists are the ones who compromise with him the most. We might disagree about how that's read, and I'd be happy to talk to people about that, in exchange for artistic excellence. There's a very heart-wrenching scene of Beethoven who, he suggests, and I don't know how I felt about that, the suggestion that the great artists, including Shakespeare, have somehow made a deal with the devil in order to create the wonderful works of art that they do. And so Goethe's Faust is a very different text from the Marlowe Faustus. Marlowe's Faustus is kind of funny at points. It's irreverent. It's Faustus devolves into playing tricks on people, and he kind of retains that trickster nature. Goethe's Faust is a more serious character, and in fact, he addresses head on from the beginning of that dramatic poem, the need to have art that is true, that is not just entertaining, that there's some kind of difference there. He really is trying to strive for truth in art, and he does that by giving these layers and layers of images and antecedents of the narrative. So he'll give you Helen of Troy, but you're also going to have that embedded with Leda and the Swan and other images of art. And it reminds me of the palimpsests that V.E. Schwab is so fond of in this novel, because Goethe is constantly reaching back and forth in mythology to painstakingly delineate the interconnections. And it's similar to me in the way that Addie LaRue attempts to plant herself as an idea that can live on even though her own name and her memory can't. Now later in 1949, Thomas Mann wrote a novel called Dr. Faustus, and in this case, the character Adrian Leverhulme was a musician, a composer. And so much in the way that Schwab interacts with the art world by creating these art pieces at the beginning of every chapter that signal Addie in some way, Mann has a comprehensive understanding of the Faustus character as an artist, as a musician through and through. And what's interesting is that his deal with the devil is actually with a woman, ends up being enacted not like Mephistopheles, but with a woman who gives him syphilis. And then this sickness actually yields his greatest art. It yields him this opportunity to have a sense of euphoria and artistic inspiration. I would just read a little bit of the way that deal with the devil is set up by Thomas Mann. So the character is speaking. Believe not, dear brothers and sisters, that for the permission and conclusion of the pact, a crossroads in the wood, many circles and coarse incantations were needed, since already St. Thomas teaches that for the fall from grace, no words are needed as an invocation. Rather, any act may be enough, even without express allegiance. For it was only a butterfly, a hetera esmeralda. She charmed me with her touch, the milk witch, and I followed after her into the twilight, shadowy foliage that her transparent nakedness loves, and where I caught her, who in flight is like a wind-blown petal, caught her and caressed her, in spite of her warning, and thus it happened. For as she charmed me, so she bewitched me, yielded to me in love, so I was initiated and the promise made. And I just love this section because I think for those of you who have read Addie LaRue, you will hear the echoes, the wood, the kind of spirituality in the sense of the spirit that is interacting with Leverhulme. And so also the way, I mean, there's much about the way in Addie LaRue that the natural world performs in this process of sort of seducing her. And what these later Fausti suggest to me is that there's a way in which suffering yields art. At one point in the novel, Addie LaRue explains that really full humanity is messy. It isn't perfect. So the indecision, the glimpses of beauty, the frayed edges, the flash of the girl's face, you know, in the paintings in the mirror, these are the ways that humanity clings to its soul. I think that's what these Faustus tales are telling us. And in a way, we almost have to look to the margins to find ourselves. So that's what I have to say about this. Hope it wasn't too long. And I'd be happy to talk with people, with anyone, or maybe just with Jen about some of these deals.
Well, we do have some questions from the audience, so we'll start with that. And if you're watching right now, you still have time to type in your question or your thoughts about Addie LaRue in correlation with the Faustian stories that Emily has just told us about. So get out those keyboards and start typing, everybody. So I'm going to start with this question, which is there a significance to the length of time that Faust um, negotiates? I mean, what's with the 24 years?
Yeah. Well, 24, I mean, 24, there is the 24 hours, right, in a day. And I think that has something to do with it. I'm sure there's magic numbers. All of these plays are very, especially the tragical history of Dr. Faustus, is very embedded in magical lore. When the performance happened to bring Mephistopheles to the stage, Faustus had to draw the circle, and invoke Mephistopheles. And if you can imagine a Renaissance audience, standing somewhere like the Globe, and they had the ability to have a Mephistopheles character come up from below with, kind of fireworks and stuff like that. I mean, muted fireworks. It probably would have been sort of terrifying, right? There could be. I'm not that familiar with anything beyond the idea of it being like the length of a day, 12 months, the way time works, even in terms of watches and things like that, that like 24 is significant in terms of how we measure time.
Oh, okay. That's a good one. Um, so the other, we have more questions now. Great. Do other deals evolve like Luke's and Addie's do, or are they more solid throughout the story? Because it does seem like every few mentions with Luke, he shifts the parameters of that deal a little bit.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's definitely not to his advantage.
Right, right. I think in most of them, the deal is set up from the beginning. And one of the things that I really love about this novel is that, and it's a great technique to keep your reader interested, right? Is that like you're constantly trying to figure out what are the limits of the deal? What exactly does that mean? So whether that deal is more articulated with Luke and Addie, and that they know, but we don't know, a kind of reverse dramatic irony. We don't know as the audience, and we are learning the details of what the deal is, though it does change, as time goes on. There's this bending of kind of the rules. But with the traditional Faustus, they were pretty much like, you'll do this, you'll do this, you'll do this, and
And
and and that
and
could be pretty much anything. They were very open ended.
and are in the previous stories, are those deals actually sort of spelled out by Mephistopheles or by Faust? Because it sounded sort of like Faust had some serious ideas. I mean, he was able to negotiate the 24 years,
Yeah,
whereas
most of the
Addie
time.
just says, get me out of this
Yeah,
marriage.
most of the time it's Faust, especially in Marlowe's Faustus. He's very bullying with Mephistopheles. He's like, tell him I want this and tell him I want that, and Mephistopheles tries to kind of convince him out of it, but Faustus, signs in blood, and he even goes so far as to he cuts himself, to make the blood, and his blood congeals. And he says, oh, maybe this means I shouldn't really do this. But then he gets a candle to like get his blood going. And in spite of the fact that he then also, signs his name and then sees on his arm homo fugae, which means like run away now, man. He gets still, he persists. So yeah. He's
Mm.
that's one of the things I think that would be interesting to think about, is this idea of the female Faust character, and what I was didn't have time really to talk about it, but when V.E. Schwab was talking, she said, "Yeah, really, there aren't any female Faust characters." But I was thinking that the Little Mermaid is kind of a female Faust,
Mm.
in that she both in the so that both in the Disney and in the Hans Christian Andersen What they end up with is different, but you know, the poor unfortunate souls that Ursula collects, that is, she makes a deal, you know. And actually, there's a lot of research on Goethe using Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid, you know, in an intertextual way. So, like the mermaid pacts and deals that they make is, I think, is in conversation with all of these.
Mm, that's a good question. Yeah, that didn't occur to me before, but I was also thinking as you were talking that Addie is also a palimpsest to the Faust stories as well
Mhm.
as talking about that. I mean, that was my favorite word of the whole book, but
Yeah.
but we have more questions. When Addie makes her deal, she gives her soul to Luke. Based on other stories with deals for the devil, would she still be thought of as human if she doesn't have her soul?
I think that's the big question at the end of the book. Because he says she's not human and that she hasn't been human since um, they met, you know, since they made the deal.
Mm,
But if she hasn't been human since they made the deal, what is he holding out for, you know, in a way, right? So I, I, I think I mean, my reading, and people could argue, but I think she ultimately does give him her soul at the end of the book, and then she's not human anymore
mm.
at that
And
point.
what would that make her, though, if she's still surviving in that human world?
Like a wraith.
Quick, let's get Victoria back. Um,
She's gonna have to make. I mean, there are a lot of. She debates. You know, I'm a ghost, right? I'm a. You know, she's not a vampire because she doesn't. But there's a lot of overlapping of all these different kinds of
mhm,
characters, right? So they, you know, much like the devils, for example, there's a whole hierarchy of devils and angels. And actually, in Dr. Faustus, there's Lucifer, who's like kind of the old devil, but then there's Mephistopheles, who's this sort of androgynous, you know, pretty character. And then there's Beelzebub, who is like this horrible animalistic devil. So, you know, um, and in the same way, I think we're in an age where we can generate and think more about, you know, what kind of, is she then kind of a fairy character? Is she, you know, what
mm.
world is she in?
Well, that gives us something else to discuss next week.
Yeah.
Um, since the deals are made with the devil, whether it's Faust or Addie or anybody else, could they really trust the devil to stick to their bargain? I mean, you're already talking to somebody who's you wouldn't think would be trustworthy.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think so. But the devil himself is such a complicated, disappointed character, you know. Um, Now we don't get that much of a I mean, we kind of get a suggestion of that in Addie LaRue, but it's definitely strongly felt in the other ones where that that character has really lost God, right? And that's devastating to
Mhm,
them. And that's what hell is, right? That you are shunned from God's presence, you know, and I think that Victoria is uh, not interested in pinning it so directly to like a particular religious angle, right? In the same way that like Marlowe's time was very invested in the details of what it meant to be Catholic and what it meant to be Protestant, and people were being killed over that. Like, um, I think I think that the Invisible Life of Addie LaRue gets a little more mileage out of this kind of, you know, is it witchcraft? Uh, is it the old gods? What does that mean, right? Um, and you know, but in some ways that does happen a little bit in the era with Marlowe. A couple of times you find him connecting or talking, not talking about God, but talking about Jove. And that's a way to kind of harken back to the Roman, gods. So plausible deniability that he's not like invoking God's name badly or something like that. Yeah.
Because that's important these days, or
Yeah.
those days. So one thing that I noticed from your talk is you said that Mephistopheles, in the old version, hell is mentioned as an internal place, not necessarily like Dante's hell where it's outside of the body. So it made me think that maybe the 300 years is Addie's hell. I mean, that's like as she's going through, but then she also has these great highs.
Yeah.
But it's also very much Luke's hell because he's still like following her around and, trying to get her to give it up already.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like everybody's hell for 300 years.
Yes. I mean, part of me thinks my internet's acting a little wonky, but part of me thinks it's interesting. There's a lot of mileage to be had over the getting Addie getting to drop into these different historical moments, but there's also a way in which the kind of repetition, right, you can feel of the dynamic between them, much like the palimpsest layering over and layering over, they almost want to be done, with it, right? And so I agree that that could be some of the an element of the hell, right? Is this endless repetition.
Well, I think that's a great place to end before we start repeating ourselves.
Yeah.
Also,
and since I'm like, I have Faust, like lights going, and I don't know.
yes, your background has started sort of flashing a little.
I become sort of spectral. Yeah.
That's the beauty of technology these days. Oh, wait, I have one more question, I believe, that just came in. Oh, Becky, thank you. Can hell be personal? Addie can't be remembered, so she suffers from the lack of personal connection. And that would be another version of her hell. So yes, definitely.
Yeah. I think Marlowe is really responsible for shifting that, idea of hell out of the medieval mindset of like it's a place where everybody goes, right? And I think over the centuries we've just, developed more and more ways of thinking about that, right? Of that kind of internal, what we do to ourselves, what we do to other people. It really started with him. That idea that Mephistopheles says, this is hell and this is where I am. I carry it with me all the time.
Right. Okay, well, on behalf of everyone watching and everybody who's going to be watching the video after this, thank you so much, Dr. Bryan, for your time and your just expertise on Faust and the story behind the story of Addie LaRue. I think it's going to make us think for a little bit longer now. So that's great. That's what Westport Reads is supposed to do. So, and I'd also like to thank everybody at home for watching us tonight, and let your friends know that they'll be able to watch this video soon. It'll be findable on the Westport Reads page and on the Westport Library. And hopefully we'll see you again soon at some programs in the library, so we won't have everybody's computers being wonky. So thank you so much, Emily, and have a great evening.
Okay, thanks.